Imagine standing on a hilltop 15,000 years ago. Below you, a river winds through open grassland stretching to the horizon. There's no fence, no wall, nothing marking where one place ends and another begins. You could walk in any direction for as long as your legs allowed and never once cross a border, never show identification, never be told you didn't belong. For nearly the entire span of human existence, that was simply how the world worked. No countries, no nations. Just land and people moving across it. Then, somewhere in the last 5,000 years, humans invented an idea so powerful that 8 billion people now organize their entire lives around it, even though almost none of them ever stopped to ask where it actually came from. So how did we get from empty grassland to a planet carved into nearly 200 separate countries? Start with what came before any of this. For roughly 96% of our species' existence, humans lived in small, mobile groups of 20 to 50 related people. There was no fixed address. You belonged to a group of people you personally knew, not a specific patch of ground. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar proposed that the human brain has a natural limit on how many stable relationships it can actually track, somewhere around 150 people. Below that number, you can manage a community through gossip, reputation, and the quiet pressure of people who know exactly who you are. Above it, that entire system collapses. And every country on Earth today contains vastly more than 150 people. Countries exist because humans needed a workaround for a brain that was never built to govern strangers at scale. That workaround didn't appear overnight. It began with something surprisingly unpolitical, the decision to simply stop moving. Around 12,000 years ago, a culture archaeologists called the Natufians settled into permanent villages in the Levant, complete with stone houses and formal cemeteries, all before agriculture had even been invented. Once you settle somewhere and bury your dead in the same ground repeatedly, that land stops being just dirt. It becomes identity. Some archaeologists argue that the earliest territorial markers weren't walls or fences at all. They were graves. But burial grounds alone can't bind large numbers of strangers together. For that, you need something bigger, a shared belief capable of connecting people who have never met. In southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered a site called Gobekli Tepe, massive carved stone pillars arranged in circular enclosures, built roughly 11,000 years ago by people who weren't farmers and had no permanent settlement nearby. They gathered from scattered groups purely to build something monumental together. The lead archaeologist's conclusion reshaped how historians think about civilization entirely. The temple may have come before the city, religion may have arrived before agriculture, belief may have arrived before borders. Shared belief lets strangers cooperate beyond the limits of personal relationships. But belief alone doesn't create a state. For that, you need grain. Around 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, humans began domesticating wheat and barley. Political scientist James C. Scott has argued that the earliest states formed specifically around grain, not root vegetables like yams, because grain is visible. It ripens all at once, standing in a field where anyone can estimate the harvest. That means grain can be measured, stored, and crucially taxed. Something buried underground can't be counted from a distance. Wheat can. In Scott's view, the earliest states functioned essentially as organized grain taxation operations, and the borders, armies, and bureaucracies that followed existed largely to make that taxation possible. But before you can tax a harvest, you need walls to protect it. The oldest known walls belong to ancient Jericho, built roughly 10,000 years ago, complete with a massive stone tower and staircase. Building it required thousands of coordinated labor days. Someone had to plan it, direct it, and feed the workers constructing it. That's not a family project. That's administration, the skeleton every future country would eventually be built on. Once you have stored surplus grain and walls to protect it, inequality follows quickly. Whoever controlled the earliest granaries controlled the food supply, and whoever controlled the food supply gained real power. Researchers studying this transition found that small, equal societies had built-in leveling mechanisms, mockery, gossip, social exclusion, specifically designed to stop any one person from becoming too powerful. Ambitious individuals eventually found ways around these mechanisms, often by claiming a special connection to the gods or by personally controlling stored surplus. Once temporary status became permanent and hereditary, you were one short step away from a king, and a kingdom is simply a country wearing a crown. Still, a small kingdom isn't yet a country in the way you understand the word today. For that, you need a city large enough that personal relationships completely stop working as a governing tool. Around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the city of Uruk grew to house tens of thousands of people, far beyond anything gossip and reputation could manage. So its administrators invented writing, not for poetry or prayer, but overwhelmingly for accounting. The vast majority of the earliest known written tablets are administrative records, grain distributions, worker rations, livestock counts. The very first written word in human history was almost certainly a number sitting next to a symbol representing a bag of barley. The country, in a very real sense, was built on paperwork. With writing and bureaucracy came the next essential ingredient: formal borders. Around 4,500 years ago, two neighboring Sumerian city-states fought repeatedly over a strip of fertile land, eventually settling the dispute with a surveyed boundary and an inscribed marker. That surviving stone monument is one of the oldest documented political borders on Earth, two governments formally arguing over exactly where one ends and the other begins. But a border between two city-states still isn't quite a country. A country requires something extra: the belief that everyone living inside a particular line belongs together, even if they've never personally met. One influential theory, called environmental circumscription, argues that in places where fertile land was tightly boxed in by deserts, mountains, or oceans, growing populations had nowhere left to retreat to during conflict. Losers of local wars got absorbed directly into the winner's territory instead of simply relocating elsewhere. Village absorbed village, chiefdom absorbed chiefdom. Eventually, a state emerged. Partly because geography left people trapped together with no alternative but to figure out how to coexist at a scale their brains were never designed for. Even after empires like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the early Indus Valley civilizations emerged, none of them were quite countries in the modern sense. A modern country requires something ancient empires generally lacked: the idea that ordinary people, not just rulers, genuinely feel they belong to the same community. That specific invention is shockingly recent. Historians typically point to the year 1648 and the Peace of Westphalia, a set of treaties ending decades of European war, as the formal birth of the modern system of sovereign states, each controlling its own internal affairs without outside interference. That legal framework gave the world its current architecture of borders, but it didn't yet explain why ordinary people would feel emotionally connected to millions of strangers they'd never meet. Historian Benedict Anderson offered an answer, describing nations as imagined communities. You will never personally meet the overwhelming majority of your fellow citizens. You likely disagree with most of them about most things, and yet you feel somehow that you and they share the same story. Anderson argued that feeling was manufactured largely through the printing press. Once books and newspapers began circulating widely in shared languages, millions of strangers could read identical words at the same time, creating a felt sense of belonging that had never existed at that scale before. Sometimes, national borders weren't shaped by belief or shared language at all, but by outsiders who had never even visited the land in question. European diplomats drew lines across Ottoman territory and colonial Africa with minimal regard for the people actually living there, and many of those borders, drawn during colonial negotiations, remain the exact borders of countries you'd recognize today. So how did humans actually invent countries? Layer by layer, almost accidentally. First came settling down, tying identity to a specific patch of earth. Then grain, creating surplus worth protecting and taxing. Then walls to guard that surplus. Then writing and bureaucracy once communities grew too large for personal relationships to manage. Then formal borders, wars that absorbed smaller groups into larger ones, and eventually the legal concept of sovereignty. Finally came nationalism, the emotional invention convincing millions of strangers they belonged to a single, shared story. Tonight, you'll go home to a country you probably won't think twice about it. But that country, whatever it happens to be, is far younger than pottery, younger than agriculture itself. For the vast majority of human history, it simply didn't exist. It exists now only because thousands of years ago, someone grew a field of wheat, someone counted the harvest, someone built a wall around it, and eventually, someone convinced everyone living inside that wall that they were fundamentally the same kind of people. That's what a country actually is, not a fact of nature. A story that enough people agreed to believe for long enough that it started to feel real.